Hello and welcome to WOLV TV Spotlight. My name's Sarah Yousif, and today we have a very special guest joining us. Writer, director, and actor John Cameron Mitchell. Known for creating the rock musical Hedwig and the Angry Inch, his work in the industry has been robust, spanning television, theater, and film. He's brought you cult favorites such as Short Bus to Oscar-nominated films such as Rabbit Hole. He's also been in shows such as The Good Fight and Thrill. John, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Do you have some guests that are not special?
So, well, every guest is special, but you're extra special. I just wanted to start today by talking about your early career. So you started off at Northwestern to get a theater degree. And during that time, you were in productions. You even starred in the Goodman Theater production of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And then you went on to have this great success. But you actually went into Northwestern thinking that you would go in and fall on a different career option. So could you tell me about this time and what led you to change your mind?
Yeah, I didn't really think of the theater was where I wanted to go, but I was always interested in writing, directing, and acting in theater as well as film eventually. So, but my dad was in the Army, my mom was an artist, and they supported that, but they always wanted something to, parents want you to be able to fall back on something, and I was like, yeah, I mean, a liberal arts degree, can be used in different ways, and I actually never graduated. With what I do, I've never really been asked for a diploma. You sort of need it more for things like teaching and, but I have been teaching at Ann Arbor, and somehow I got away with not having a master's or a bachelor's degree. So from the beginning, I had amazing teachers at Northwestern. It was a more conservative time, if you can imagine an entire giant theater department and everyone's in the closet, which is, unusual at best. But it was also a difficult time. I came out into AIDS, and it was political, and it was life and death, and it was exciting too. Chicago was a big theater town at that time with Steppenwolf Theater, kind of schooling New York in what theater should be.
So speaking of that crisis, in the middle of your schooling, the AIDS crisis was at its peak, and this instilled a lot of fear in the queer community. But this was actually the time that you decided to come out. Could you tell me a little bit about that decision and if your schooling or career had any impact on it?
Yeah, when I was there, it wasn't the height, it was the beginning of it, but I definitely came out into it, and I came out in my senior year, when people either go insane or they become themselves, right? Or both. And so it was in the air, it was always part of the deal, but also people were like, if you want a career in acting, you have to be in the closet, especially in film and television. And I was like, really? It just seemed really, they could tell me what to do on screen, but didn't people tell me what to do in my life? And when people were dying, it was just like, don't tell me what to do. In fact, your actual fear and your closetedness actually help spread AIDS. It's the actual shame of it that kept it in the shadows, which stopped the possibility of education about safe sex. Certainly the government, Reagan didn't say the word AIDS until like 18,000 people had already died. Whereas he's, spending millions for Legionnaire's disease where, a couple of people died. It was because they were like, you deserve to die, you're gay. So these kind of lies and this kind of hatred galvanized me pretty early, and I was like, I just, I don't want to be in the closet. I don't care if my career suffers. I don't want to work with someone who doesn't want to work with me if they know I'm gay. So I did a play called The Destiny of Me by Larry Kramer, and I played Larry Kramer, who was a famous AIDS activist as well. And in an interview in the New York Times, it just kind of came up, or actually I brought it up. I think they said, how much do you relate to this character? And I said, well, I'm gay, and there's certain things in common with this character, and it just wasn't a big deal. This was like 92, but a lot of my friends were shocked that I would do that and, in their view, limit my career. But I was like, you know what? I feel freer now, and I don't want to work with bigots. So it was nice. Other people were coming out at the same time, not as many, and AIDS was still in the air. But the rage about AIDS and our fear of neglect and the hatred led directly to Hedvig, to me creating the character.
So speaking of that musical, since then you've broken a lot of barriers in the media industry, and a lot of that started with that rock musical. It's a complex story about a rock musical and a quest for self-identity. Could you tell me what went into making that musical?
Well, I wrote it with composer Stephen Trask, who wrote the songs, and my dad was a general in the Army, actually in the closet himself, but loved my mom. They were together till the end, but we lived in Germany, so the Army world was part of Hedvig's story. She was a boy in East Germany who could only escape communism by changing their gender and marrying an American GI. And they didn't really want to change their gender, but it's more of a story of what, in effect, the powers that be, the patriarchy, whatever you want to call it, does to define you, define us. A woman is a man without a penis. That's how they defined it. And so the mutilation of the powers that be of this character was the story, rather than it being, say, a trans story of discovery. It was a story of mutilation, really. And then the character coming out of it and finding their wholeness through the metaphor of Plato's story of the origin of love, where the gods, we used to have 4 arms, 4 legs, 2 faces. The gods cut us in half to cut us down to size, so to speak, and we're always seeking our other half. This is a 2,500-year-old myth from the queer Plato. And the queerness of rock and roll was something, Little Richard, in effect, a black drag queen invented punk rock and rock and roll, in my view. And people like David Bowie and the Stones and the Beatles all looked to him as the beginning of that ecstatic kind of punk. And so Hedvig came from that lineage, of Bowie, Little Richard, Lou Reed, Iggy Pop, who, was signed to his record deal in Ann Arbor here in 1968 by my friend Danny Fields, who is here today doing a panel with us about punk.
That's very exciting. With that story, like you said, it's a complex one. It's multifaceted. You have Hedwig, who is going through a botched sex operation. You have Tommy, the son of an army general. They're very complex characters. When you came up with them, what went into that, and did you put yourself in any of them?
Yeah, I was the Army's general's son, so Tommy was kind of I saw as the main character, and Hedvig was based on my brother's babysitter, whose name was Helga, who was a cis woman, but the character was there. So elements of my life certainly ended up in it, but I'm not Hedvig, and I'd say it's more emotionally autobiographical than anything else. And we built it up over 4 years until, and developed it in non-theatrical spaces, because the theater tends to blunt the rock and roll energy. So we kept it in clubs and spaces like that to keep that energy up. Basically, I was combining all the things I liked: Broadway musicals, punk rock, drag, comedy, stand-up comedy, performance art, in one piece. That at the time people were like, "What's with why are you trying to commit career suicide? You already have a good career as an actor, and award-winning." And I'm like, why is it career suicide when you're trying to do something new and good? Well, it'll never be on Broadway. I was like, I'm not trying to make money with this. I'm trying to make something new. And one by one, each person interested, we signed them on the mailing list, and it was, pre-digital, so every person was well-earned, and we found our people, and we opened off-Broadway in '98. All theaters in New York had rejected us because we were too odd. So we built our own theater in an old hotel.
Yes, it ran at the Jane Street Theater, and then it later found its success on Broadway and all of that. But then you later adapted it into a film.
Yeah.
So there are multiple differences between the film and the play, notably that the play is interactive and the movie has two different timelines. What went into maintaining the original while still deciding those differences?
Well, the play is in the form of a gig. Hedwig's talking to an audience and is following around her ex's giant stadium tour. So he's always kind of next door, interrupting her show. And the structure of telling the story to the audience remains in the film, but the film, rather than a gig, is a tour of gigs in a failing seafood restaurant called Bilgewater's that somehow she gets with her managers, Phyllis Stein, has managed to get any number of these restaurants to do a gig in, inappropriately or not. And she tends to, follow Tommy around again. If he's at Soldier Field in Chicago, she's in the, Bilgewater's / Applebee's next door. So the structure is the same in the film. It's just now we see all the events that are described.
That makes a lot of sense. So after you had all that success with that musical, you went on to create Short Bus, which broke even more of these taboo topics. And a big part of Short Bus is the aspect of sexual freedom. It takes place in a sex salon, but it's not just meant to be explicit. So what went into making sure that those intimate scenes meant more?
Well, I just would ask people to look at their own lives. I mean, people think of explicit sex as pornography, and I'm like, well, actually, that's not the definition of explicit sex, because is the sex in your life pornography? No, pornography is used for a purpose, to masturbate. So people in America, which is a Puritan society, from the right and the left, I notice, nowadays young people are not having sex like they used to, and I blame the internet, I blame porn, I blame COVID, I blame all the screens, and if you're watching porn for 5 years, how are you going to have real, actual sex without your head exploding? So Hedwig was much more of a kind of an anti-digital, let's get back in the same space kind of thing that was a love letter to New York and what was happening and also dying in New York because of real estate, spaces where people could experiment. This wasn't particularly a sex salon. It was a salon in the old European sense that people would come to your house and there'd be food and drink and art and performance and in this case, sometimes sex in one of the rooms. And it was based on places that existed in New York in the early 2000s, like a salon called Cinema Salon a friend had, and there was sex and 60 millimeter movies and food, and it was, all of them were equal, as important parts of our life. And I liked that. And growing up super Catholic, and sex was so bad, I needed to break that scar tissue up. So we just showed it last night, actually, in Detroit, and it went really well. I sometimes show it with a live drunk director's commentary. So I'm talking during the film while drinking or getting stoned, and that's fun. But it was interesting, it did well. It wasn't like a huge hit, but it found its way through the world, as did Hedwig, and influenced a lot of people in a very strong way. And that's the point of why I do it. The money is really a byproduct. Making any money is not common when you're making something new or unusual. But like I remember having friends saying, you can make a lot more money with Short Bus if you remove the sex. I'm like, I could also remove the sex from my life and have a lot more money because I would be busy working, I'm like, I could also remove the songs from Hedwig. It's like, what are you talking about? This is what it's about, and we created it through improvisation with the actors so they felt very comfortable in creating their characters and what they were doing. And just like in any other scene, the sex scenes have to have goals and obstacles. If everything's going fine, it's kind of boring unless you're having the sex. You know what I mean? It needs just as much conflict as any other scenes.
Definitely. So you were actually in that film as well as acting in Hedwig. What was it like being able to embody the characters that you created?
Do you mean Shorpa specifically or Hedvig?
Either
I
or.
mean, Shorpa, I was just in the
Yes.
orgy room, because the actors are like, you got to do this too. I'm like, all right. Hedvig, I don't know if I wanted to be in the film as an actor because I was more interested in the directing, but there was no one else who could really do it. And I realized in retrospect it was actually good to act in it because it released some of the tension that comes up with directing, is singing the songs, and performing. And we did a lot of the singing live because I think lip syncing, punk rock is absurd. But I directed myself one other time, which was I like to work in different formats of storytelling, and one that I really try to be innovative in is the fictional podcast series. So I made a musical called Anthem Homunculus that is now available with 40 songs, 40 actors, Glenn Close, Cynthia Erivo, Patty Lupone. I play a character with a tumor that's sentient, played by Laurie Anderson. So that was a lot easier to direct myself because it was only audio, and I could take more time, and not get distracted by the direction. And I've made other fictional podcast series. My latest one is called Cancellation Island, about a rehab for canceled people that Holly Hunter organizes and her character organizes. So I'm always up for new ways of telling them, and if one gets more expensive or, right now independent film is kind of dead, the streamers killed it. So there's an opportunity for a new movement, I think, in film because Hollywood has abandoned it. And the technology to make things is cheaper than ever. The distribution of them is the new thing that has to be figured out. But I think there's a time for a new kind of independent filmmaking that is more punk. Certainly we're in, a time of fascism, and that is when the best art comes out, and it is useful. When you have a president telling you that all news is fake, except his news, then I say all stories are true, and they might be the only ways we have to convince people now is through stories and empathy.
Definitely. I want to talk about another story that you brought to life. After you had success with your early films, you ended up directing Rabbit Hole, which starred Nicole Kidman. And this was very different than your early film projects. It was about a couple that was grieving their son after a car accident. But what many people praised about it was the emotional aspect that can also be found in your other films. What went from transitioning this emotional aspect to a completely different genre of film?
I don't really believe in genre. It's like I think it's a capitalist term, to sell things. I feel the same way about identity politics. Identity in this country has become capitalist. It's just so it's a barcode to me. It's like identity is personal. We're all sort of an identity of one. I don't like shoving people into bins. I think it's not conducive. We change every day, and I don't like to be in a prison called identity. So for me, genre is the same thing. And young people are taught to be capitalist by social media. And, instead of monopoly money or money, it's clicks and likes. And so it's genres and this. And what are you, what are you? And what, I only like this. And it's like, well, life is a lot of things. Life isn't one genre. It has comedy, it has humor, it has music, it has whatever. So my films never really fit into when there was a video store, Blockbuster shelf. It didn't fit in anywhere, which means it's harder to market, and that's fine with me. Rabbit Hole would more fit into a straight ahead, drama, I guess. And I've, Hedvig and Shortbus were my films before that, but I, as an actor and a writer, had written all kinds of styles. Those were just the two that were made. And, I've certainly acted in films in plays like Rabbit Hole, which I love. I lost a brother who was very young, and the story rang true. And I really wanted to do it more for my family.
With that, you've done a lot of acting aside from what you've directed. You've been in series like The Good Fight. What's the biggest difference between acting in roles that you made versus acting in roles that are given to you?
Well, you didn't write the script. I didn't write the script is the main thing. But since I started acting again after a big break of about a decade, the first thing I did was The Girls. And I met Lena Dunham at an event, and we exchanged numbers. And she texted me and asked if I wanted to play a role in her show. And I'm like, I was a little bit nervous. And it's like, can I look at the script? She's like, yeah. And I was like, it was good, but could be better. And I'm like, can I rewrite my dialogue? She's like, sure. And so she would let me do that. So every time, and it made me feel more comfortable, I liked what she was doing. I just wanted to fix some things. But it's up to her, and we ended up doing bits of both of our writing whenever we did scenes. And I would do the same with The Good Fight, Shrill, Mozart in the Jungle, all the other shows I did that, especially comedies, where there was a bit more flexibility, so that's different from when I was acting before, in that the TV people like, sure, let's see, what do you think, but then they have the final say. That's their job. But I, as an actor, as a director, I always ask my actors for their ideas.
That makes a lot of sense. So before I ask you my last question, I just want to talk about the work that you have coming up. You have a play coming out about a anti-Nazi surrealist artist, and you also have a feature film about an AIDS activist named Peter Staley. Could you tell me about either of those projects or any other ones that you're excited about?
Yeah, I'm working on like 10 projects, but one is a play about Claude Cahun, the surrealist, and that's very germane to today. They use their art to fight Nazi occupation, almost in the way, almost like Banksy or something. They use their art, almost like graffiti artists. They would paint stuff on pennies and break into churches and put up banners, and they were older women by then. It was Claude and her, in effect, wife, Marcel, in the 40s, in Isle of Jersey, in the English Channel, and that I'm very excited about. We're doing a reading next month with Melanie Linsky and Marin Ireland. Just great cast. And then the movies are early on. Peter Staley, an important AIDS activist who used, in effect, his applied punk to save our lives. And they did. ACT UP and TAG, another part of ACT UP, saved us with getting these drugs to us faster over the hatred and neglect of the government. So there's also a film about Allen Ginsberg in 1968, sort of about the end of the 60s in a way. There's an interactive theater piece, an immersive theater piece I'm working on. There's also a memoir. I'm working on a memoir that I gotta have a book deal for, and then I might be stepping into a role on Broadway in February.
That's very exciting.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on.
Yes, definitely. Is there any specific project that you're extremely excited for, or are they all kind
They're
of the
all
same?
exciting, but the play, Claude Cahun play, which is called LSM, is the most imminent.
And then for my last question, is there any project specifically that you've done that you hold near your heart, or that's your favorite?
I guess Hedvig or Shortbus. I mean, the thing that I think is my best work is probably Anthem Homunculus, the podcast series, which I've even done as a marathon experience. We mixed the podcast for surround sound in a cinema, and we created abstract visuals, and had a 7-hour experience with dinner of everybody in the theater listening together, which is kind of what used to happen in the 30s, 40s. Everyone gathered around the radio, and I think Anthem Homunculus is the best thing I did. Yeah, Shortbus was the most fun, I think.
Why do you feel like that was your best work?
Because it's immersive. It's autobiographical. It's dealing with the idea of God, the idea of death, how they're related. It's the first half is sort of about my actual life, and the second half is what if I hadn't left my small town, come out, shared my art, collaborated, what would have happened to me? So it's a kind of a speculative autobiography.
What's it like being able to share that story in such an art form?
What do you mean?
Like, what's it like being able to have that autobiography in an artistic way where you're really able to showcase yourself while still having these artistic elements that you can add in?
I don't usually like autobiographies because people tend not to be the best judges of themselves. So I prefer ones that are more collaborative and narrative like that. Though my memoir obviously will be a certain amount of that direct autobiography memoir. But yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, it's relieving. You know, you're getting things off your chest, but you're also creating it in a metaphoric way that might be useful to someone else. I get annoyed by the last few years dictum of, you know, is that your story to tell? You can't tell a story that's not your own. And I'm like, well, what the hell does that mean? I know where it comes from. It comes from not enough interesting stories coming from new people. It was always the same people telling the same stories. But to me, what does that mean? Am I not allowed to write a character that is not me, you know, is heterosexual or black or rich or, you know, it's like, what do you mean? You know, that's not your story to tell. Is autobiography the only thing that's okay now, you know, politically okay? I find that absurd. Imagination, finding out about things, you know, Toni Morrison, when she taught writing, all of her students were like, I'm going to write about my mom. She's like, you will not. You're too young to write about yourself. You're going to write about something you know nothing about. And that is the beginning of empathy. That's the point of fiction, is to identify with someone you're not. So you can do it lazily, and you can plagiarize, and or you can do it deeply, find out everything, and go with that flow. And that's what I do, you know. And I'm a Toni Morrison person.
Well, that's amazing. I believe that's all the time we have for today. So thank you so much
You're
for joining us. This was super inspirational to hear, and I'm very excited for your new projects. That's all for today's WOLV TV Spotlight. Thank you so much for joining us.